Chapter 14 from Chains by Laurie Halse Anderson. Saturday, June 22nd, 1776. The next day I carried a basket of eels from the fish market to Wall Street, thinking only of hot eel pie for supper. I had not eaten hot eel pie since Mamma died, Miss Mary Finch not being fond of it. But Master Lockton enjoyed the dish, so fat eels weighed down my basket. I fervently hoped that Becky would drop off their heads and strip off their skins. It made me go all jumbly in the belly to chop off their heads. I entered the kitchen and set the basket on the table. Ruth hummed quietly to herself, shelling peas into a large wooden bowl, and Becky chopped kale. Madame walked in the front hall, her hair half fallen out of her cap, and stains of sweat under the arms of her dress. She crossed the room, peered out the back door, crossed her arms over her chest, and tapped her foot with impatience, then disappeared into the next room. "I require you, girl," she said. Becky looked at me, eyes wide and warning. "Ma'am?" I asked. Madame came back into the kitchen carrying a silver tray. She shoved it into my arms. "You will serve your master and his companions." Becky slowly shook her head back and forth. "Are you sure, madam, that's what the master requested?" she said slowly. "'Tis hard to interpret the ways of menfolk, them being so complex and all, but surely when he said, 'Let nothing disturb me,' that was indeed his true meaning." "Be quiet, Becky," Madame snapped. "You have the manners of a donkey and the voice of a goose." Becky said nothing, no more, but chopped faster. Madame paced back and forth. "The mayor of New York is a supremely important man, could well be the next royal governor. It is hardly appropriate to welcome into our home without offering him refreshments." She turned to me. "You will not put 1 foot wrong." Then when the tray was loaded so heavily I could scarce lift it, Madame preceded me down the hall and waited by the closed door to the library. "Go on," she told me, without offering to help. I kicked at the door with my shoe and called out, "Wine, sir, and a bite to eat?" "Leave us," responded Lockton. Madame knocked on the door with not terribly refined fist. "Come now, Elihu, show some graciousness." Deep voices in the room conferred. Then the door was unlocked and opened. Madame stepped toward the opening, but Lockton filled the frame. "Thank you, dear," he said. "The girl can serve us. I'll send her to you if I'm in need of anything more." Madame tried to look beyond him to the distinguished guests, but could not see through the thick form of her husband. "Very well," she said loudly. "I shall be composing a letter to our cousins in London, our cousins who are so well regarded by His Majesty." "Excellent suggestion, dear." He stepped out of the way so that I might enter. There were only 2 men besides Master Lockton, Gold Buttons, wearing a shabby waistcoat of black wool, and the third man, who I took to be the mayor. The mayor had a fine wig on, properly powdered and pulled back, with a curl at the end of his queue. A sable coat and matching breeches, a maroon waistcoat, and a white silk cravat tied loosely around his neck, atop his shirt. The windows were all closed, but sun streamed in, heating up the room in a slow simmer and bringing forth the ripe stink of underwashed gentlemen. A broad, brightly colored map of the coastline was spread on the master's desk, weighted at each end by heavy books. Lockton removed one of the books and the map curled on itself, clearing the desk for the plate of Gloucester cheese and rye bread and the bowl of strawberries that I'd set there. "My most sincere apologies for the interruption," Lockton said. He took a glass of wine from me. "Pray, sir, continue." Gold Buttons took a hasty bite of cheese before speaking. "It has proved more difficult to bribe the patriots to change sides than we had anticipated. Those who are fed up with the situation prefer to melt out of the city and walk home to Massachusetts or North Carolina." I removed the serving tray and retreated to my corner. The horses in the painting still leapt from the fence. I fought the temptation to reach for the Adventures of Mr. Crusoe on the shelf. Instead, I centered my eyes on my feet and my thoughts upon a slice of eel pie. "They turned down the offer of 100 acres, Lockton said. "The land offered by the king is distant from their farms." Gold Buttons buttered a piece of bread. "My fellow reports they simply want peace and the chance to get it in a good crop of wheat." "Idiots," said Lockton. "The news from Philadelphia is that Congress is close to declaring independence," Gold Buttons continued. I fought the urge to yawn. The master and his friends would complain about the Continental Congress at such length that I feared my ears might just drop off. I fought the urge to yawn. Lockton plucked at a strawberry from the bowl and pulled the leaves from it. "And Admiral Howe continues to delay the invasion? It's maddening. The Crown must smash this rebellion into dust so we can return to our former lives with a sense of order." And higher profits, Goldbuttons added. If Madame only knew how dull these gatherings were, she would not have been so anxious to barge her way in. I would have been happily chopped off the heads of a barrow full of eels to escape another afternoon of being trapped with men whose voices droned on and on and on like rumbling, dusty grindstones. The mayor set his goblet on the desk. The time for bribery and persuasion is past. This is the hour when we must unsheath our swords. Swords? Lockton shook his head. We've been over this, David. Our task is to hold the city loyal, nothing more. The mayor leaned back in his chair. Holding is not enough. They're coming after us. They're raiding our homes for lead and our stores for anything they desire. Goldbuttons wiped the cheese from his fingers with a handkerchief. I agree with the Yahoo. A loyal New York cuts off New England from the other colonies. The rebellion will wither like a vine cut off from its roots. Cut off a vine and it will grow back, said the mayor. You must pull it out of the ground and burn it to ensure that it is properly dead. Lockton put the strawberry leaves in a bowl. Is there a plan afoot to destroy them? Most definitely, the mayor's voice was quiet but steely. This was not idle prattle about Congress. I stood as still as possible. The mayor scratched at the mustard stains on his cuff. General Howe delayed the invasion, hoping the revolutionary fervor would die down. On the contrary, independence sentiment now burns as far away as Georgia, as well as the western frontier. I am a bookcase, I thought. I am a piece of furniture, not a girl who will remember every word spoken in this room. The cry for liberty has proved powerful, Lockton said. The beast has grown too large, the mayor said. If it breaks free of its chains, we are all in danger. We need to cut off its head. Goldbuttons frowned. How so? We must kill the commander. Lockton drew in a deep breath. With Washington gone, the revolution will collapse, predicted the mayor. War will be averted and countless lives saved. Our world will return to the former state of tranquility we enjoyed before this nonsense. So you can see here right now that they're having this huge discussion because the Patriots are actually gaining ground over the Loyalists. So they don't know what to do. They've tried bribing, they've tried offering land, they've tried everything at this point, but it still seems like they're falling behind. And the idea from the mayor is that the only way we can do this is to cut off the head, which is Washington. So they need to assassinate Washington, and this is the plan. So let's continue. The study fell so silent I feared the men would hear my heart beating. Kill General Washington? No, Lockton said, shaking his head. Not possible. He's a gentleman. Capture him, arrest him, yes, but we dare not harm him. The mayor ticked off the reasons on his fingers. All of the American leaders have committed treason against the king. You can't deny that. Treason is the highest offense under English law, worse than murder. And what is the punishment for treason, my friends? Neither Lockton nor Goldbuttons answered. To be hung by the neck until dead, then have your body chopped into 4 pieces, which are sent to the 4 corners of the kingdom. The mayor continued. Others propose we send sections of Washington's corpse to Charleston, Philadelphia, and Boston. They want to keep the 4th bit here to be displayed in front of our city hall. The room fell silent again. I could hear the ticking of the hall clock through the wall. Lockton shook his head again. You can't guarantee Parliament would rule treason. It's too dangerous. If we dispose of Washington, Parliament will do whatever we ask. But how can you accomplish this, said Goldbuttons. The man is surrounded by an entire army. We have a man in the lifeguards committed to our plan. He spends his days within 2 arms' length of the general. On our signal, he will act. And this is why you need the money, Lockton said. There was a sound of a lid being removed and the jangling of keys. Lockton took a key ring out of the blue china snuff jar on the corner of the desk. He unlocked the top drawer and removed a tall stack of currency, enough to buy a village or 2. I let my eyelids droop as if I were dozing. The risks are too high, Goldbuttons said in a shaky voice. If we're discovered, we're dead men. Think not upon the risks, but the rewards, suggested the mayor. I peeked. Lockton tugged at his collar, to loosen it. Suspicion will fall on my neck first, David. I require assurance that my role will not be betrayed. You have my word, the mayor said. Your promise is not good enough, sir. Lockton pushed a sheet of paper, a quill, and the inkstand across the desk to the mayor. Write down the names of those who know of this plot. Why? Goldbuttons asked. The paper will serve as my insurance should I fall into rebel hands again. It will motivate you and our friends to do everything possible to secure my release. How? Goldbuttons was still frowning, but the mayor reached for the quill. If we do not come to Elihu's aid, he will betray our names to the enemy, the mayor said softly. He's showing his weakness. Planning ahead is my strength, Lockton said. Do not forget your own name, sir. So Lockton here is trying to protect himself because he knows that if they find out that there's a plan to assassinate Washington, he's going to be the first to be under suspicion. So he's making them sign a paper to say who knows about this plot so that if he does get arrested, he can turn them in. He can basically squeal on them. And so he thinks of it as a strength. The mayor thinks of it as a weakness. I closed my eyes again and the quill scratched across the paper. Gold buttons shifted nervously in his chair. There, the mayor said. I opened my eyes the tiniest bit. Gold buttons quickly read the paper. A vast conspiracy indeed. He handed it to Lockton, who read the names and smiled. We are keeping good company. He handed the money to the mayor and lifted his empty glass. I believe this calls for a toast, gentlemen. I did not step forward with the wine bottle. Lockton needed to believe that I was a sleepy servant, unaware of his plans. Sal, he snapped. I drew back my head and I acted befuddled. Wine, Lockton said. I crossed the room and I emptied the last of the wine into his glass. Lockton frowned. Go fetch another bottle, he said. Yes, sir. I curtsied and I left the room, pondering how I was going to pass this news along to Curzon. That was when the blood-curdling screams started in the kitchen, and I dropped the bottle and ran. So this is great news for Isabel, who actually overheard this news. Being a spy for the Patriots, she now needs to tell them, because this is her ticket to freedom, any information that she can pass on, and this is really big. This is somebody wants to assassinate Washington. So she's trying to figure out now how is she going to get this news to Curzon. But the chapter does end with the blood-curdling scream. So now she's confused. She's kind of forgotten what she's doing. She's going to have to go and see what all the screaming is about in the house. Hopefully we'll find out in chapter 15. Thank you. Chapter 15 from Chains by Laurie Halse Anderson. Saturday, June 22nd, 1776. If you remember in the last chapter, it finished off with a blood-curdling scream that Isabel was going to try and find out what was happening. She also had quite the secret that she needed to tell Curzon. Let's see what happens. It's the devil! Madame screamed as I opened the door to the kitchen. Ruth had fallen at her feet and lay there, her body shaking violently. Peas were scattered across the floor, and what I'd feared most had happened. Madame snatched the broom from Becky's hand and raised it over her head. She has the devil in her! No, madam, it's an illness, I cried. An ailment, nothing more. Madam brought the broom down on the small, twisted body. Ruth couldn't raise her hands to protect herself. The seizure held her fast, her arms and legs stiff and trembling, her eyes wide but not seeing. Out, devil, madam shouted as she again raised the broom over the head. No! I threw myself on the top of my sister. The broom came down on my back, once, twice, but it didn't matter. I had to keep her safe until the storm passed. The broom handle cracked and Madam tossed it aside, and I heard Becky yell something. Then Lockton's loud voice boomed, Enough! The room quieted, except for the soft bumping of Ruth's limbs on the floor. I looked up and Madam held a chair prepared to throw it at us. Her husband pulled it out of her hands. Ruth's body suddenly went limp. What is the meaning of this? Lockton asked. She's possessed, Madam sputtered. I will not have a demon child in my house, Elihu. I will not. I ran my hand over Ruth's face and I spoke to her softly. Her eyelids fluttered and her mouth moved. Come back to me, baby girl. Come back, Ruth, I whispered. Wake up now. It's gone. Blown away. Come back, Ruth. She looked confused. She always did after a fit. I helped her sit up, a little blood and soaked through her kerchief at the back of her head where she'd hit the floor. The wound would need some cobwebs. Lockton sent Becky to the study with the wine. He bade Madam to sit on the chair she had nearly broke over my head, and took a seat himself and addressed me gravely. Your sister has the falling sickness, he said. Does this happen often? No, sir. Ruth wiped her tears on my sleeve. This is not a matter of inquiry, Madam said. I will not have evil in my house. Becky walked in, poured cider into a chipped mug, and handed it to Ruth, who took a large mouthful. Madam took a step backwards. The child's cursed with poison, and it will poison us all. I want her sold, Elihu. I want her sold today. Sold? Wife, started Lockton. You can't sell her, I burst out. Hold your tongue, girl, Madam commanded. Ruth drank the last of the cider and stood up. Lockton reached out and set his hand on her shoulder. They're sisters, Anne. One must remember that. Please, Madam, I said, she's too little. She'll be hurt. The room fell silent except for the plopping sound of peas falling to the bottom of a wooden bowl. Ruth was picking up the peas that she'd spilled. The sound reminded me of pebbles plunking into a deep pond. Becky carried a mug of cider to Madam. Look there, the little one's already back to her chores, and she did a fine job sweeping earlier. How often does these fits take hold of her? Lockton asked. Speak truthfully. Sometimes once a day, sir. Sometimes weeks will go by. Once a day? Madam's voice rose again. Oh, Lockton. The mayor called from the study. The master studied my sister, then tugged his waistcoat over his belly. The girl's harmless and useful. She'll still work in the kitchen with Becky. That is my decision. Do not disturb me again with womanly prattle. The kitchen fell silent as the master walked away, and when we heard the door to the study close, Madam pointed at Ruth. Don't let her near the milk. She's going to curdle it. And don't get used to her presence here. Elio will soon see my reason. She stalked off, leaving a sour smell in the air. Ruth crawled under the table to pick up the peas that had rolled there. I watched her and tried to stop my hands from shaking. What will happen to us? No way of telling. Becky pulled an eel from the basket. It's near impossible to hire help, what with folks running off in fear of the war. She cut off the eel's head. Long as you two stay out of trouble, she grabbed the eel's skin at the neck and pulled it all the way off. I imagine you're safe enough. I bent down to help Ruth with the peas. So this is a bit of a turn of events for Isabel again. Ruth does have seizures, a little bit of an epileptic attack. I imagine back then they wouldn't have known very much about this. They wouldn't have special medicines like they would now. So she has these seizures that take over her. Of course, not understanding this, Miss Lockton thinks that she's possessed by the devil and definitely just wants her out of the house. So she's threatening to sell Ruth, which scares Isabel to death because she does not want to be separated from her sister. Luckily, Mr. Lockton stepped in and said, you have to keep her, but how long will that last? We're not sure. So that's the end of chapter 15. Next, we're going to read chapter 16. So today we're going to read chapter 16 from Chains by Laurie Halse Anderson. As you remember in chapter 15, Ruth was having her seizures and was really upsetting Miss Lockton, who was threatening to sell Ruth again, but Mr. Lockton stepped in. This leaves Isabel in a bit of a predicament. She also has that really deep, dark secret about the assassination of Washington. Let's see what happens. Sunday, June 23rd, 1776. Ruth fell asleep cooked that night, my arms around her. I'd washed out the blood from her kerchief and hung it to dry. There was a lump on her head, but it would go away. Madam's threats would not. I slowly pulled my arm out from under my sister. She sighed and curled into a tiny ball. I had pondered the problem all day and half the night. No matter how many times I turned it around, I found the same answer. We had to flee the city. I sat and pulled the blankets over Ruth, tucking under her feet to keep her warm. The wings that could spirit us away were hidden in the master's desk. I had to take the list. It would buy us our freedom. But Bellingham would not listen, not after the incident with the linen chest, so I had to deliver it straight to the army. The sound I had been waiting for broke through, the low roar of Master Lockton's snores starting up as the grandfather clock chimed midnight. I put on my skirt and I made my way to the bottom of the stairs. The hour was upon me. It was time to act. The moon was my friend. It lit up the library enough for me to make my way without stumbling into anything. The snuff jar stood on the corner of the desk. I held my breath as I lifted the lid. I put my hand inside and I slowly pulled out the keys. I crouched behind the desk and I examined them in the moonlight, only one small enough to fit in the top drawer's lock. I inserted the key and I turned it gently to the right. There was a dull clunk. The drawer slid open a hair. I forced myself to remain still and to count to 20. Lockton's snores continued above, regular as waves crashing against the side of a ship. I pulled open the drawer and I peered inside, and it was crowded with abandoned quills, a rusty tinderbox, a few coins, and pound notes, which I was so sore tempted to take. I felt through the drawer with careful fingers. What has he done with the list? Was it in his coat pocket? I reached into the back of the drawer and I pulled out the black hair ribbon. Had he given it to Gold Buttons for safekeeping? Ah, there. From the farthest reach of the drawer, I pulled out a single sheet folded. I held it to the light and quickly read. It was the list of names with the mayors at the bottom, and he had titled it, Committee to Preserve the King's Peace. I tucked the paper in my pocket, tied it tight, and slipped it under the waistband of my skirt where it could not be seen. I closed and relocked the drawer, and then I carefully returned the keys to their hiding place. I tiptoed back through the house, and I slipped outside, quiet as a ghost. The air was hot and dripping, as if the city were wrapped in a wool blanket just pulled from a boiling pot. I made my way along the streets, seen only by cats, rats, and a slave hurrying by with a bundle on her head. Since she carried a lantern and no doubt had passed from her master, she was allowed to be out walking after dark. I was not. The woman said nothing as she passed by me, but started singing the second verse of Yankee Doodle in a strong voice, which I thought was curious indeed. I listened close to the words. Father and I went down to camp, along with Captain Gooding, and there we saw the men and boys as thick as hasty pudding. She was sending me a message. I dove behind a log barricade just as two soldiers turned the corner, talking intently to each other and sweeping the street with their eyes. I said a quick prayer of thanks to the singing woman for her help. When the echoes of the soldiers' boots had vanished, I moved on, staying away from the lights of the sentry fires, passing under the dark shadow of King George's statue and the bowling green, and hurrying to my destination. So a very close call for Isabel. She's taken the papers out of Mr. Lockton's desk, and now she's going to bring it directly to the army in hopes of securing her freedom for her and Ruth at this point. She was very lucky here. Somebody helped her along the way because she is not allowed to be out after dark unless she has a pass from her master, which we all know she does not have. The battery was the fort at the southern tip of the island with high walls and cannons that pointed out over the water to discourage enemies. It was headquarters of the Patriot Army in New York. Even if General Washington was elsewhere, here I would find an officer who would understand the value of the list. I marched past the rows of tents set up on the ground outside of the fort, trying very hard to ignore the men and boys who stared as I walked by. As I neared the gate, a sentry stepped out and blocked my way. "Do you have a pass, girl?" I swallowed hard, and I tried to remember the name of the colonel who worked with Master Bellingham. Fagin, Jaden, McRaden. Well, a few other soldiers drinking coffee outside their tents stopped talking to observe. "Please, sir," I said, polite and firm. "I've come with an urgent message for Reagan? Colonel Reagan, sir! Tell me, and I'll see that he gets it." "I cannot," I said. "I must deliver it to him personally, sir." "Who's your master?" Telling a lie would not benefit me. "A loyalist, sir, who would beat me bloody if he knew I was here." He looked at me and yawned. "Come on, then. I would do for a walk to keep me awake." I followed him inside, past a room of men sleeping on the floor, along a hall to a small room where a low fire smoldered in the hearth, a chair drawn up before it. The moonlight had broke free of the clouds again and lay in gray pools beneath the windows. A table stood by the door where a heavy-set man scratched away on a piece of paper, his work lit by a half-dozen candle stubs that would soon burn out. The soldier drew himself up to his full height. "This girl has a message, sir, claims it must be delivered in person." The man lifted a hand in the air and continued with what he was writing. I tried to make out what it was, but his scribble was dreadful bad. Finally, he laid down his quill, and he moved his spectacles high on his nose and peered through them at me. "What is it?" he asked. His voice sounded raw, like it had been rung against a grater. An onion poultice was tied around his neck. I dropped in a polite curtsy. "I have information for Colonel Reagan." "Who sent you? Who's your master?" "I cannot say." "Then who will vouch for you?" I vouch for myself, sir. I am new in this city, and I know only a boy named Curzon." One caterpillar eyebrow lifted above the glasses as he recognized the name. "Bellingham's Curzon?" He coughed loudly and sprayed drops of spittle on the page. "He's all bluster." He dipped his quill in the ink pot and continued to write. "Take her away, Sergeant. I'm too busy for this." My escort grabbed my arm. "Come now." I tried to break free. "Please hear me out." I shook my arm. "They want to kill him." I pulled with all my might, and I lost my footing. Both the sergeant and me stumbled against the table. The ink bottle overturned and poured across the table and papers. The sick man jumped up with a mighty curse and several ugly statements about my character. "They want to kill the general." I finally pulled the paper out of the sergeant's grasp. "I have proof." The man was concerned only with rescuing his papers from the spreading pool of ink. "Sergeant, remove this birdwit." "Do not touch her!" The commanding voice came from the center of the room. The sergeant stood at attention, and the man with the inky hands did too. Swallowing hard and wincing at the pain in his throat, a figure rose from the high-backed chair that stood in the front of the hearth. He wore the dark blue coat of an officer, with buttons and buckles that reflected the firelight. His features stayed in the shadows, but I could see a book in his hand, his fingers marking the page. "Leave us," he ordered. "Yes, sir," the sergeant said. "As you wish, Colonel Reagan, sir," said the man, whose clothes were now stained blue by the papers he clutched to his chest. When the door was pulled behind them, Colonel Reagan returned to his seat. "Come here," he told me. Show me what you've brought me and tell me your story, but keep your voice low. These walls have ears." "Yes, sir." My voice was strangulated a bit. The colonel tugged at his coat as he sat down, and he was not wearing a wig as did most gentlemen. His own hair was dark, pulled back into a neat queue, and tied with a string. His eyes were sunk deep into his face with dark hollows underneath them. "Well," he set his book on his lap, fingers marking where the place he had been reading. I weighed my words before I spoke. "I am in a position to trade with you, sir." "What kind of trade?" "My sister and I were wrongfully taken from Rhode Island. I mean to get us back there." "You want passage home in exchange for what you know?" "Yes," I said, lifting my chin a little. "Sir?" He nodded gravely. "If your information is as useful as you think, I shall personally look into your case, miss." That was far from a berth on a swift ship, but I didn't have much choice. "They plan to kill General Washington." He closed the book, set it on the floor, and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Tell me all." I handed him the list and quickly told him everything I knew. He interrupted me a few times with questions and had me repeat the mayor's words. Then he bade me to wait by the dying fire as he left the room. As soon as he reappeared with 4 other men, all clearly dragged from their beds, I was fighting to stay awake myself, but I repeated the story to the larger assembly. A quarrel began instantly, the arguments flying across the room. "How do we know Lockton didn't send her with false story?" "There's just a list of names. Anyone could have written it. I know the mayor's handwriting, and those are dyed-in-the-wool loyalists, every one of them. I don't believe they turned a lifeguard. Those men are the finest we have. This isn't nonsense. I'm going back to bed." Her story confirms what we've heard from other sources. This from Colonel Reagan. He explained that several spies had brought on him the same rumor earlier in the day. He walked to the hearth and looked at the glowing embers. All that remains is to decide what to do with the information. Who has the list? A man wearing his uniform coat over his nightshirt waved the paper in the air. "Return it to the girl." "Why on earth would we do that?" he asked. I wanted to plant it back where she found it. "'Tis best that they believe their plan is still secret. That improves our chances of rounding them up." The man handed the list back to me. I thought for a moment about tossing it into fire, but then suddenly seemed frightfully dangerous, so I folded it back into my pocket. "Do you think you're going to be able to return it to the same desk?" Colonel Reagan asked me. "Yes, sir," I said. "If you hear anything else, anything at all, you come and find me. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," I hesitated. "And you'll soon help my sister and me get home?" His eyes darted to his companion and back to me. "I shall do whatever is in my power," he promised. "Thank you, sir." "She'll need the code to get into the camp," said the man in the nightshirt. "The new regulations go out at dawn." "Agreed." Colonel Reagan bent down so his face was level with mine. "Do not tell this to any other soul. On pain of death, do you swear?" "The code, I swear," I whispered. "The code is ad astra." "Repeat it, please." Ad astra. I'd never heard such a word, but then again, I'd never before been spoken of a code. 2 words, ad astra. It's Latin. It means to the stars. Will you be able to remember it? I never forget a thing, sir. So in this chapter, Isabel does make it to see Colonel Reagan of the Patriots with the list. She finally does get in to see him after much hassles with the first man she talked to. But she does get the message across. She still really, really believes that he is going to help her. And he really wants the information. Apparently they've heard this from other sources, so it's not just rumors, or it is rumors, but they've heard them from multiple sources. So he wants this information. He tells her to take the letter back and put it back in the drawer because he doesn't want Lockton being suspicious that the Patriots actually know about the letter. So she's to bring it back to the house and hide it back in the desk. And then if she hears any other information, he's given her a special code so that she could actually get back into this camp to give him any more information. And so he tells her the word ad astra, to the stars, and hopes that she's going to remember it. But we all know Isabel, she doesn't forget anything. So that's the end of chapter 16. So now we're going to read chapter 17. So today we're going to read chapter 17 from Chains by Laurie Halse Anderson. So yes, the last chapter we read, we found out that Isabel was able to get a message to the Patriots, to Colonel Reagan, about the fact that the Loyalists are planning to kill General Washington. So this was a really big step for her. This was very scary for her, but she did it because she's hoping to secure her freedom. Colonel Reagan does tell her that he's going to help her, but we don't know if he actually will in the end. But he does give her a code, a special code name, ad astra, if she does have any more information, or if she hears any more from the Loyalists, the Locktons that she's working for, to come back and tell him. So let's see what happens in chapter 17. Sunday, June 23rd to Friday, June 28th, 1776. What with my busy night as a true spy, code word and all, and the heat in the upper gallery of Trinity Church, I fell sound asleep during the sermon the next morning. I woke when the people around me stood, so startled that I popped up from the pew and near toppled over the railing. The next 2 days were long and hot, and I awaited word from Colonel Reagan. Master Lockton did not notice that his list of co-conspirators was a little hard-worn. He was too busy visiting the mayor at his home in Flatbush and spending hours at his warehouse reviewing his accounts. Madame took her meals upstairs. Only Becky was allowed to serve her because of Madame's fear of the demons that claimed to inhabit Ruth. Becky said Madame sat sighing by the window and shuffling a deck of playing cards over and over. We didn't bother keeping Ruth away from the milk, of course. Instead, we kept one ear open for the thud of Madame's feet on the stairs, and when she approached the kitchen, one of us would whisk Ruth down to the cellar. Ruth understood none of this. She didn't complain about the egg-sized lump on her head or anything else, and after we finished our business in the privy each morning, I took her to check out the mystery garden. The green shoots were 2 hands tall, but gave no clue about their identity. It was perfect growing weather, especially for flowers and corn and strawberries. It was the perfect weather for going home. I practiced the code over and over until it felt like a prayer in my mouth. Ad astra, ad astra, ad astra. I was desperate to talk to Colonel Reagan about our release from the city, but dared not leave Ruth alone in the house with Madame Lockton. The thought of Madame putting Ruth up to auction was a constant torment, like bees darting in and out of my sight, daring me to swat at them. The gossip from the market was fantastical. Becky brought back tales of sea monsters chasing the British fleet and a 2-headed calf born outside Philadelphia that portended all manner of disaster. Folks were prickly and fearful. Loyalist shopkeepers had been tarred and feathered by angry mobs, and the shops had been destroyed. Each day dawned hotter than the one before. Ad astra, ad astra, ad astra. 2 mornings after my meeting with the colonel, a visitor pounded at the kitchen door. I was kneeling on the other side of it, polishing the lock with an oily rag and rotten stone. The noise near gave me apoplexy. When I opened the door, I was shocked to see a messenger, but not to see a messenger, but the round figure of Mr. Goldbuttons. Instead of wearing a hat or coat, he had a long cloak draped over his head, and his wig was askew. He stormed past me towards the stairs. "Is your master still abed?" he shouted back at me. "Yes, sir." Goldbuttons dropped his cloak on the floor and ran up the stairs as if his breeches were on fire. And a moment later, Master Lockton bellowed like a stuck bull, then thudded heavily across the floor and yelled for Becky. The plot to kill Washington had been uncovered. I was sent to fetch Madame home, for she had gone to call on a friend. Goldbuttons had vanished by the time she returned. Madame hurried to the library and told me to fetch her ivory fan from her bedchamber, for she was feeling faint from heat and excitement. And as she opened the door, I caught a glimpse of the master pacing frantically, his nightcap still on his head. He looked up and saw us. "Thank heavens, there's so much to do and no time. The worst has happened, Anne." I started up the stairs to fetch the fan, moving slow as possible to overhear their words. "What is the meaning of this, Elihu?" Madame demanded. "Listen carefully," Lockton interrupted. "The rebels know. I've sent for a cart. We must burn my papers." "Dear God, protect us," Madame prayed. "How much do they know? Wait, 1 moment." I took the steps 2 at a time and neared to the top when Madame stepped into the hall and pointed at me. "Forget the fan, girl. We need firewood for the fireplace," she said sternly. "Now!" Lockton and Madame were exchanging heated words across the desk. By the time I brought an armful of wood and a few coals from the kitchen in the copper coal carrier, they seemed not even to notice that I'd walked in. "You're abandoning me?" Madame asked. "You're going to be safer here." Lockton dumped a folio of papers on his desk and rooted through the mess. "Aunt Seymour isn't leaving, and we have credits with all the merchants." "Your aunt despises me," Madame said. "You must stay to defend our name and honor." I arranged the wood so that it would not catch quickly. I set the hot coals underneath it, and I leaned forward and I blew gently. "I'm guilty, Anne. They won't give me a parole this time. As soon as the rebels are driven out, I will return." "But what if they arrest me?" Madame said. "Let me go with you." "No, you must stay here to keep them from stealing everything we own." Madame picked up the blue china snuff jar off the desk and flung it against the wall. It shattered and left a mark on the plaster. "I will not," she shouted. "I will not be left at the mercy of our enemies while you slink away." Despite my best intentions, the kindling wind caught hold of a spark and burst into flames. Master Lockton crossed the room to pick up the keys that had been hidden in the jar. He placed them in his pocket. Then, without warning, hit Madame with all the force in his arm. She flew into the bookcase, causing several books to tumble to the ground. I almost reached for her, but I was afraid to anger Lockton any further. I command you to stay here, Anne. This is your duty, and you will obey me. He turned to me. The fire is satisfactory. Leave us. Yes, sir. I closed the door, and Madame started in again, begging him to take her with him, or at least to let her know where he was going. A carpenter soon arrived and nailed the master into a large crate marked cheese. As the final boards were being put into place, Lockton told Madame that he would first head north, then to Dr. Van Bersken's house in Bergen Country. 3 men loaded the heavy crate onto a cart driven by a man I had never seen before. Becky tended to Madame's battle wounds with ointment and medicinal wine. I offered to fetch Lady Seymour, but in truth, I planned to run the news of Lockton's escape to the rebels as fast as I could. Madame insisted we all stay in the house with the doors and windows locked. She passed the night burning packets of paper in the fire and demanding gallons of tea and fresh biscuits. So it's been discovered that Lockton is part of the people who wanted to have the General Washington assassinated or killed. So he's really worried now. So he's going to leave New York because he's afraid that if they arrest him, well, they will definitely arrest him and they won't let him go this time. Madame Lockton's not too happy about this because she has to stay behind to protect the house. She's not happy. She puts up a fight, and of course he continues to beat her. We know that this is a pattern with them, that he does beat her frequently. So she's going to stay. When the soldiers arrived at dawn to arrest the master, his business papers were all ash and the crate of cheese was long gone. The angry soldiers tore through the library but found nothing save for the shards of a snuff jar. These they stomped under their boots before they departed. Becky went to the market and left me to clean the mess. She returned with a freshly killed hen and a basket full of beet grains. Before Becky could remove her bonnet, Madame shuffled into the kitchen. What news? Madame demanded. Her red eyes perched above the dark rings from a sleepless night. A livid purple welt had raised to the left side of her face where Lockton had struck her. Most of the bruises on her arms and shoulders were hid under her gown, but she walked stiff and sore as an old crone. Becky gave her the gossip from the market stalls. Conspirators who plotted against American cause had been arrested all over the city and in several close-by villages. The mayor, 2 doctors, a shoemaker, a tailor, a chandler, a gunsmith, a drummer, and a fifer were all charged with the treason and a host of other offenses. How did they uncover this plot? Madame asked. I picked up the beheaded chicken and carried it to the basin. I held it by the feet so the last of the blood would drain out of before I plucked it. Becky hung her hat on its hook and pinned on her apron. One of the conspirators flapped his mouth and the story poured out. Hickey, his name, a tall Irishman who served in General Washington's Life Guards. Did anyone mention Master Lockton? Only that he was the one who got away, ma'am. They caught one feller trying to cross the East River. Couldn't row hard enough against the tide. The master is well out of harm's way. Which is more than I can say about myself, Madame muttered, gingerly rubbing the violet bruises on her wrist. So they actually have rounded up a whole bunch of people who were in this conspiracy. Lockton was the lucky one. He actually got away in time. So Miss Lockton's still not happy about being alone, but we'll have to find out what happens in the next chapter, chapter 18.